Greetings to everyone. Glad that you could join us today. I'm Jim Mose, the Executive Director of Faith and Finance Ministries at the Pension Boards. And I am joined today by my colleagues, Jonathan Lee, our Philanthropy Officer, and Paul Ramsey, our Major Gifts Officer. You'll be hearing from them a little bit later. Raising funds in hard times presents a conundrum. So on the one hand, hard times typically result in major economic challenges like unemployment and loss of business. And that's the case whether it's a global calamity such as the COVID-19 pandemic or a local or regional disaster such as a wildfire, flood, or tornado. On the other hand, even as money runs short in many cases, hard times can create unprecedented levels of need for housing, for healthcare, for food, and for justice. So, how do we raise funds to address expanding needs in the midst of economic distress? It can be done. Our experience in the pension boards in promoting the Christmas fund offering during the pandemic was positive. In fact, 2020 was the most successful fundraising year in the history of the Christmas fund. So I'll lay out several keys to that success that my colleagues Jonathan and Paul will build upon. First and foremost is the affirmation that no situation is hopeless and we are not helpless. While hard times can cause widespread suffering, they do not negate the love and grace of God. Now, our scriptural reference for this workshop is taken from 2 Corinthians, the first chapter. Here, the Apostle Paul talks about God's comfort for us in times of affliction. But Paul doesn't stop there. He also affirms our need to comfort others in their affliction. In other words, in the midst of suffering, God is in solidarity with us, and we are called to be in solidarity with others. We are called to become God's co-workers in the healing of deep wounds. So what does that mean in terms of our fundraising? Well, even as needs expand exponentially in hard times, the hard times themselves make a powerful case for giving. For example, the Pension Boards has a long history of providing grants to clergy and eligible lay workers through the United Church Board for Ministerial Assistance. And as you can imagine, requests for emergency grants rose dramatically in the midst of the pandemic. Healthcare expenses increased. Pastors and lay workers lost their jobs or had wage and benefit cuts. Members in discernment were stuck in the transition without any income. Retirees could no longer supplement their incomes with supply preaching, and sadly, there were funeral expenses. So we focused our appeal on immediate and pressing needs. Those and other pandemic-related needs, they made the case for giving to the Christmas fund. And our philanthropy team leveraged that case by aligning it closely with our mission. Now, mission alignment is critical. A disaster is generally not a great time to start fundraising for a new organ. But it is the right and the necessary time to ask people to help address those pressing needs that are caused by the hard times. And make those needs clear to donors by telling compelling stories. It might be a need to rebuild homes after a flood, a need for food assistance in the midst of high unemployment, a need for a robust advocacy program in the face of injustice. But show how your church's mission can help address the needs that grow out of the hard times. So let's take powerlessness off the table. Let's realize that people want to help. They want to make a difference. Let's recognize that asking people to give in the midst of hard times can actually be empowering. It's a way to overcome helplessness. So in the pension boards, we ask people to give, and we ask them repeatedly, and we ask them sensitively. We knew that many of the people we sent communications to were personally impacted by the pandemic and they couldn't help financially. We affirmed our understanding of those situations, and we made sure that eligible recipients for hardship grants, for emergency grants, knew how to access them. Pandemic-related hard times, they made a strong case for giving that aligned directly with our mission. And to that, we added stories of impact. We showed that donor generosity does make a difference. Rents got paid, food was bought, medical expenses were met, utilities were paid, and much, much more. Essentially, we were saying, donors, here's what your generosity looks like. Here's your impact. How hard times can inflict suffering on a very large scale. But let hope abound. The Apostle Paul reminds us that through the suffering of Christ, God extends comfort to us. And we are now called to extend our comfort to those who suffer during the hard times. There are lots of ways in which that can be done. And one of the ways is by raising funds in support of efforts to bring about wholeness, healing, and justice. I'll now turn to my colleague, Jonathan.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for tuning in on a Friday. It's good to be with familiar folks and new friends as well. And I have the privilege of telling a story of how hopefulness did abound in the fundraising world, even in the midst of tough times. Raising dollars for the Christmas Fund, which is one of the 4 special mission offerings of the UCC, has been going on every year for more than a century. In 2019, a total of about $1.5 million was given by just short of 2,500 churches across the denomination and by 795 individuals who gave to the Christmas Fund, not through their local congregation, but directly to us in New York. Last year, in 2020, more than $1.8 million was received in total, including gifts from 2,116 individuals, which is nearly 3 times the number of the previous year. The number of church gifts did drop in 2020, and you can imagine that was because of the disruption to worship patterns and church life in general. But fewer churches were collecting more dollars. So in terms of donors and total dollars received, as Jim told you, 2020 was the best year ever for the Christmas Fund. So how did that happen? Well, we wanted to begin by describing what our pre-pandemic approach had been to raise dollars for the Christmas Fund. Each year during Advent, we equip local churches to receive the offering, usually on the 4th Sunday in Advent. Also, each year in December, we make a separate appeal to past and potential individual donors. And then again in July, another appeal to just past donors. The promotional materials that we've typically sent to churches and to individuals have consistently relied on 2 themes, 2 approaches. The first one of those is telling potential donors how the funds have been used, total dollar amounts applied to each of the 4 assistance areas that are supported by the Christmas Fund, and how many people in each program have benefited. And when you use numbers, you're able to create pie charts to kind of give a visual accent to some of that data. So we've relied on telling folks the basic numbers behind where gifts have gone. We've also, the second theme that we've used is to incorporate testimony from assistance recipients. But it was primarily testimony about the relief experienced by recipients and less about the circumstances giving rise to the need in the first place. Our thinking has been that everybody knows that ministers don't make a ton of money, so let's not focus on the problem. Instead, let's focus on how the money provided brings relief. So we made robust use of the thank you notes that we received over the course of each year in our appeals, like this one. Stephen, next slide. Thank you. So, typical. Once again, I am thanking you for the most generous check I received. Every Christmas I receive one, it brings back happy memories of all the small churches I served. They could not afford much, sometimes not even my salary, but as an experienced pastor, I was able to leave them stronger and more self-sufficient. Now, you have made it possible for me to have a joy-filled Christmas. So, generally, data and thank you notes have been our bread and butter approach to raising Christmas fund dollars in our individual appeals and in the materials that we've supplied to churches. But then the pandemic arrived and the entire landscape changed. Churches were immediately and visibly impacted, not just in the suspension of all in-person worship and meetings, but obviously also financially. Sources of income began to dry up. Church building renters couldn't make use of the space and so didn't. And church members faced their own financial cutbacks, some losing their jobs. And lots of congregations felt the hit also because many weren't technologically prepared when the weekly offering couldn't be physically received. In time, some pastors and chaplains actually lost their jobs, as well as some lay church workers, and many saw their hours and their income reduced. Applications for emergency grants paid for by the Christmas Fund, as Jim told you, skyrocketed. So very quickly, the financial needs of ministers and others serving the church went from being a familiar but non-specific circumstance, mostly seemingly impacting those who serve small congregations, to a precipitous calamity having impact across the culture of the United Church of Christ. There was real urgency, no time for eloquence and persuasive data. The reality of the shared affliction was immediate, and it pushed everything else aside. And so we began to flip our approach, realizing that this affliction, directly acknowledged and honestly shared, would make the case for giving far better than poetry and persuasive data. So we began telling our Christmas Fund story with less words and more captivating pictures. We created materials that were intentionally designed to be straightforward, accessible, and reproducible so that others, pastors, and other advocates could make use of them without a lot of interpretation or explanation. We asked more frequently, and though that might sound counterintuitive in a time of hardship for everyone, we did so, and we did so by mail and electronically. And by the end of 2020, we had begun to reach out through social media and text to give platforms. And we also produced videos that, as I think we all began to recognize, became indispensable during the pandemic. And now we understand them to be an expected tool for fundraising of any type. And those videos relied on individuals who were able to, in the telling of their story, narrow a vast and general need into a personal and very specific story. And the video that became really the centerpiece of our Christmas Fund appeal in 2020 featured this retired minister who you're about to hear from, and we wanted to share the video with you. So Stephen, if you would.
So, December, we're lost, we're shattered, and Mom and I had a conversation about how Christmas was going to be very humble. So we were facing a very lonely time. Then in the mail came a check from the United Church of Christ. Christmas fund. That was not really part of our consciousness, especially mine. And that check meant so much to us that the wider church remembered us. We didn't know who we were anymore in the church. We weren't the minister's family. We were so adrift. But the national church knew about us and knew that we had a sad Christmas before us. So that check meant the world to us. And it was a much better Christmas than we had thought it might be. It was because of the Christmas fund, entirely. Because of that experience of being known and remembered by the national church, I felt even more connected to the denomination and to our local church. When the pandemic hit and the world screeched to a halt for a while in March of 2020, and churches were thrown into total disarray, pretty early on, I received a letter asking for additional contributions to the emergency fund, knowing that there would be ministers impacted by the difficulties of this time. As you might imagine, I got out my checkbook and wrote a check right away. I know what it's like to feel lost and abandoned and confused. And I know what it feels like to receive a gift that makes a huge difference. And I want to be part of that. It had such a powerful effect on my mom and me, especially that very first year. And I want to be part of that healing and that graciousness for others. And that's why I've given through all of these years to the Christmas Fund and encouraged other people to do it as well. And I continue in my retirement to make donations. It's one of the ways the world goes round, isn't it? It's one of the ways the Holy Spirit moves among us, that we multiply grace upon grace and help each other out. I want to be part of that.
So Kathy told a powerful story, and overall in our campaign for the Christmas Fund in 2020, we didn't shy away from the rawness of the situations our people everywhere were experiencing. We talked about actual lost jobs, lost income, deaths of loved ones, isolation, the same kinds of circumstances we knew that our donors would connect with, would relate to. So here are the opening sentences from one of our 2020 Christmas Fund appeal letters. And you can see how the tone has definitely changed. We identify real people we know who were in real trouble. Local church pastors in New Jersey, Ohio, Hawaii, North Carolina, and Nevada. A retired minister in New York, financially dependent upon supply preaching. hospital chaplains in Pennsylvania and Minnesota. The financial lives of these and dozens of other servants of the United Church of Christ have been upended because of COVID-19 and its impact on congregations and nonprofits. Many have been laid off. Others have seen their positions eliminated altogether. The end result of our support of those who serve the church through the Christmas Fund is about providing relief and hopelessness, and hopefulness rather. But by shifting our focus from only that desired end result and including the reality of immediate need, the circumstance made the case for giving organically and allowed compassion and generosity to emerge as the most natural response. Our Christmas Fund appeal shifted from emphasis only on the relief gifts could bring to the deep need that made those gifts so urgently necessary in the first place. By talking directly about urgent affliction and not only the good accomplished through giving, donors were moved to respond in greater number and with more dollars. Also this past year, in 2020, we made a parallel application of these new principles gleaned from the pandemic. In addition to our Christmas Fund fundraising, the Pension Boards is in the midst of a $20 million capital campaign to A, be ready for the increased assistance needs as the baby boomers retire in greater numbers, and B, to sustain and expand our leadership programs that serve clergy at various seasons in their pastoral careers. Here is the cover of our 18-page campaign promotional booklet. It is detailed and comprehensive, and it has been the go-to resource for introducing the mission of our campaign, which is called Generations of Service, Faith and Finance in Action. But the programs this campaign will fund include those assistance grants supported by the Christmas Fund. And we learned our lesson from that Christmas Fund campaign, shifting our approach in the same way. The pandemic created urgency. Urgency forced us to make our capital campaign case in far fewer words, describing the bottom line impact of UCBMA, the United Church Board for Ministerial Assistance, reliability in every circumstance. These panels from a brochure that we created effectively say everything that is conveyed in those 18 pages of text, simply by using current images and identifying the current and future challenges. This time, next time, every time. The support available from the United Church Board for Ministerial Assistance is for the long haul, through this and through future hard times. So, by taking the biblical mandate to faithfully acknowledge our afflictions together, and not just our hope, and applying it to fundraising practice, shared struggle, simply stated, makes the case and opens the door for hopefulness, which is then acted out through generosity. And now I'll ask my colleague, Paul Ramsey, to carry us forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. And like Jonathan, it's great to see so many familiar faces. At the beginning of our session, Jim provided a thoughtful reminder of the power of inviting people to give and the faithful biblical precedent of calling people to financial stewardship, even when times are tough. Difficult times highlight the reasons we are called to be people of hope, people with a shared mission. The startling biblical witness is that inviting people to give may be the most hopeful thing we can do during hard times. As Jonathan described, the decisions we needed to make during this pandemic year as the philanthropy team at the pension boards. I hope, as he was describing that, I hope you were able to relate your experience and your responses. As you heard and saw the steps we took, did your mind race to about possibilities for creating a video for your own congregation or your own conference? What are the real challenges and creative responses to them that you could tell in your community with a few words and some captivating pictures? Videos, PowerPoints, and brochures are collateral materials that members of your community can use independently to proudly share the focus and mission of your organization and actually raise money. Not necessarily as a member of a stewardship committee or as a member of the clergy, but as committed individuals who are living and telling the story themselves. Remember, the more particular and specific we choose to be often makes our appeal more universally appealing. The point of this workshop is not to prescribe for you a one-size-fits-all approach to fundraising. We're providing an illustration about how we adapted to trying times in our specific situation. And we hope the illustration can inspire you to develop your own plan of how to move toward an attitude, a theology, a practice of generosity and abundance in your individual setting. As a fundraiser for the pension boards and the United Church Board for ministerial assistance, the pandemic and other important events in 2020 reminded me of of things I'd learned long ago as a local church pastor. Fundraising and thoughtful stewardship are always about gratitude, mission, and community. It's easy for professional fundraisers, and let's not pretend that most local church pastors, conference ministers, and other church leaders are not called to be professional fundraisers. It's easy for us to get caught up in the latest best practice. It's easy to look at the success of other churches and organizations and begin to believe that the platform, formula, consultant, company, or a gadget they use is the way we will achieve fundraising success. It may be more difficult, or at least less exciting, to go to our own people and personally thank them for their commitment and generosity and ask them to give more for a more specific reason than we have in the past. It may be more taxing on us to do the work of clarifying again and again and again, if necessary, exactly what the mission is for which we're raising money, of speaking plainly about hard truths and disquieting realities. But this type of back to basics leadership is exactly what calls our folks deeper into real understanding of our basic purpose and to personal investment as both generous givers to and storytellers themselves about the vision and impact of our communities. In my 20 years at Mayflower Church in the Denver area, I found this type of mission-driven stewardship to always be most successful when I invite members to tell their own why I give stories. Pretty similar to the 2020 Christmas Fund, drawing its water from Reverend Kathy Barker's beautiful personal testimony. A compelling speaker would be the octogenarian who grew up in the church, was married at the altar, raised his children in the youth group, and grieved his wife's death in the sanctuary. Or the newish member who joined a few years back because the sign out front said, "Come as you are." And the people inside behaved like they actually believed that motto. These mission-driven stories of community are far more captivating than any prepackaged campaign because they are real stories of grateful members of your church and your conference who experienced deep needs met. Now, here are the broad strokes, the takeaways of what we're suggesting to you today. Number one, anxieties honestly and directly expressed, make room for appreciating hopeful solutions, which equals mission. 2, raising money in hard times must be more personal and specific. 3, lifting up positive outcomes is important for conveying accountability and effectiveness, but needs directly expressed makes the case itself. And as you saw with the Generations of Service brochure, this time, next time, every time, fewer words, more captivating pictures express urgency better. Also, it's always best, number 5, to narrow vast need into personal testimony, like the heartfelt video featuring Reverend Kathy Barker that we all watched. Number 6, devise materials others can easily use. And 7, volunteer solicitors are especially meaningful and effective in difficult times and hard times, and communicate need and mission better than polished fundraisers, and often better than the folks, the ministers who are being paid by the congregation. In difficult times, those who are moved enough, anxious enough, know the affliction well enough to get out there and share will be the most effective. Number 8, diversify mechanics. Ask more frequently, as Jonathan said, mixed delivery platforms, trust that less can be more. And as highlighted in number 7, then enlist non-fundraisers. So how are you going to develop a thoughtful, ambitious, unapologetic culture of fundraising and abundance? The 3 of us hope this workshop has sparked ideas for you and has given you permission to move forward with a mission-based fundraising strategy that does not shy away from naming needs and telling the story of how your community meets them. The pension boards, Jim, Jonathan, and I also want you to know that we, the 3 of us, are all willing partners for you in your fundraising ministries. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us for help or a bit of brainstorming in fulfilling our calling. As Jim so eloquently said earlier, of raising funds in support of efforts to bring about wholeness, healing, and justice. We thank all of you so much for your time and for joining us today to talk about this important topic. Thank you so much.